I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker with Freethought Radio. And that's some of the background music from the online video at the website of our guest today. Our next guest is the journalist Janet Heimlich. Janet Heimlich received a BA in communications from Stanford, after which she began a long career of producing and writing corporate commercial film and video presentations in California. For 8 years, Ms. Heimlich freelanced as a reporter for National Public Radio. She won 9 journalism awards, including the prestigious Katie, given by the Press Club of Dallas, the Houston Press Club's Radio Journalist of the Year, and Texas Bar Association's Gavel Award. She's also written many nonfiction articles for publications such as Texas Monthly, the Austin American Statesman, and the Texas Observer. She's exposed the injustices of capital punishment and in our prison systems. Her newest book, just released, is called Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. It's the first book to take an in-depth look at child abuse and neglect caused by religious belief. So welcome to Freethought Radio, and congratulations on your upcoming book, Janet.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So could you tell us what some of the catalysts were that got you researching and deciding to write a book on this topic?
Sure. Both personal and professional, I would say. I became a mother rather late in life, at the age of 41, and it was really only then that I became more attuned to child parenting issues. I had enrolled my daughter in a Montessori school and started to learn a little bit more about compassionate parenting. So it was from that framework I started to ask friends of mine just how they were raised, and learned that many people I knew were raised with a lot more religion than I was. I say in my book that I really was raised with hardly any faith at all. I call it watered-down Judaism. We had a Christmas tree in our living room every year, and
That is watered-down Judaism.
Yeah, so it was sort of there. We knew it was there, but there was really no discussion about faith at all. And I guess I just sort of, all these things culminated, and there were also news stories that I began collecting. This was pretty much on the heels of when the Catholic child sexual abuse scandal became widely known, and during 1 week, the Pope came to the United States for the first time to acknowledge child sexual abuse in the institution. And that same week, there was a massive raid on West Texas fundamentalist Mormon sect where hundreds of children were removed based on concerns of child abuse. So, and all of this snowballed, and I did also come across a very severe case where a toddler had died in a Baltimore cult. I felt like this book needs to be written.
So the book is called Breaking Their Will. That's a chilling title. And obviously the point of your book is not to lead people away from religion or to embrace your non-religious views, but in the book you do have to rebut some of the cliches or some of the myths about religion and its treatment of children. What are some of the assumptions and misconceptions about religion and about the Bible pertaining to children and children's rights? I do want to say that I really make clear that this is not a book that bashes all religion. From the get-go, I acknowledge that, and this is based on interviews I had with many people and, of course, much writing that I've read, that raising a child in faith can be a great experience for that child. And some of people, friends of mine, have attested to that. So that's not a place where I'm coming from. But what I do want to do is differentiate between unhealthy faith for a child and healthy faith. There is this preconception, I think, and this idea that many Americans are raised with, that all religion is great and it could never lead to anything terrible, especially something as terrible as child maltreatment. And I use the term maltreatment because that includes both abuse and neglect. So my
first major point in the book is to just say, let's come from a place of reason where we can admit that religion can both help children, but it can also harm them. And so,
like corporal punishment in the Bible, right, where the Bible says you should strike the child.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to most people of faith, certainly conservative Christians, they're going to say that, the Bible just says wonderful things about children, and Jesus loved children, and so forth. But if you really take a look at the text, you will see that there's very, very little in the Bible that really talks about children being important people. And much of what it does say about children has to do with violence against them. For example, as you point out in Proverbs, there's repeated passages that tell parents to use, quote, the rod on children, or raise children with authoritarian parenting styles. But in addition to that, if you take the Ten Commandments, you'll notice that the word children is used only once, and it's not in a flattering way. And then there are also many, many stories in the Bible that talk about children as victims of violence, and some of that is perpetrated supposedly by God.
So, how do these biblical injunctions get in the way? How do they create the problems that you are documenting in your book?
Well, I think that if we're dealing with reasonable people of faith, they're not going to take these kind of passages and have it justify abuse. But where I do have big concerns is with very conservative believers, orthodox, fundamentalist, extremist believers who feel obligated, whether it's because they were raised that way or because they are just wired that way psychologically, that they will feel obligated to harm children because they feel that it is righteous, that it is somehow sanctioned by God or somehow mandated by their faith.
Well, could you talk a little bit about that heinous case, which I remember in Baltimore? Tell our listeners what happened.
Well, this was a one-house cult of just a handful of people, but it also included children in addition to those adults. And there was a toddler who was one of those children. He was not saying amen at mealtimes.
And he was a toddler.
He was a toddler.
Right.
So his mastery of English probably wasn't all that great anyway. But the head of this group, a woman named Queen Antoinette, apparently was infuriated by this, and she ordered everyone in the group to stop feeding the child. He was put in a room and not given food or water, and as a result, he starved to death. What is even more shocking is that one of the adults who was implicated in this case was the boy's mother. And I have talked to the dead boy's grandmother, who's just been devastated by this. But what's important to look at here is that you can have, a lot of people think that, well, these crimes might just be committed by people who are crazy or just terribly sadistic. But oftentimes there are a number of perpetrators who act together, and the social dynamics, the psychological dynamics have to be better understood, because here you had a number of people who all contributed to this boy's death. Because
if that mother disagreed with the cult, she would be betraying her religion and her culture, and she had to make a martyr of her own son to test her own faith then.
Exactly. She was essentially powerless just based on the social hierarchy of the group and the belief system of the group. And this was for lack of a better term, this was a Christian-based cult. This was not some sort of, voodoo-related thing that came from some other country. And I think that's got to be understood, that a majority of the cases that I looked at were Christian-based. And it's not because Christianity necessarily lends itself more to child abuse than other faiths. It's just that this country has more Christians in it than others. And I think you would see that same type of proportion play out in other countries. If they had more Muslims, for example, you would see more crimes that were Islam-related, and the same in other countries if it had another type of population.
Well, okay, but I would say that either the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, the Quran, these are all behavioral grab bags. And so if somebody is a true believer, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That's the danger of literal belief in a holy book, isn't it?
Exactly, especially when you consider that these books were written centuries ago when children had way fewer rights than they even have now. So if people cannot come to grips with the idea that these books were written by people that were not as enlightened as we are, and certainly we have a lot of problems still today, then you're dealing with people who are treating children in a way that can be quite cruel.
I am Laurie Gaylor with Dan Barker. We are speaking with journalist Janet Heimlich, who has a book coming out in early June, I believe. Is that right, Janet?
That's right. It should be out around June 1st.
And it's called Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Maltreatment. How can people order the book now? Who's the publisher?
The publisher is Prometheus Books, and it can be pre-ordered on Amazon, and it will be available on ebook, I guess, in a few weeks.
So we will be right back to conclude our conversation, learn more about religious maltreatment in the name of religion, and we'll be right back.
I'm Michael Newdow, and this is Freethought Radio.
Protect the First Amendment. It protects you. This is Freethought Radio.
I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker, and welcome back to the final segment of Freethought Radio. We've been talking with the journalist and the author, Janet Heimlich, about what happens when religion is misused to break the will of children. Her book is called Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. It takes an in-depth look at child abuse and neglect caused by religious belief.
I thought it would be fun to hone in on the title of your book, Breaking Their Will. Why did you call the book that? And is that sort of at the heart of this abuse?
Right. Well, breaking their will is actually a commonly, it used to be a very commonly used term among conservative Protestants who found it necessary to break the will of children, both emotionally and physically, in order to essentially allow them eternal salvation. So you will read in many conservative Christian parenting books, some that are in print today, some that are on the websites today, that talk about the concept of breaking the child's will. So in my book, the section on physical abuse, which is corporal punishment driven, there is a section specifically on this idea of breaking the will. But the reason why I titled my book that is because I do believe, as you suggest, that it is at the heart of religious child maltreatment. And I actually dedicate the book to children who have been denied the right to question, because I feel like at the heart of religious child maltreatment, it is denying children the right to ask questions, to explore their own spiritual path, to essentially have individualism and be considered to be an important person in our society.
Isn't it more than just getting them into heaven? Isn't it also parents wanting to control the kids so the kids don't embarrass the family and they don't stray from the family values? Right.
I guess I was telling you what is professed and what is put out there. But there are, even though you have those underlying motivations, and certainly many parents do would love to control their children and not be embarrassed when they're at the grocery store and have their children act out and that kind of thing. But I do think it's also important to understand that there is a strong theological basis for these ideas.
Yeah, I was just
and
thinking
they are
about
spoke of very bluntly.
Like Proverbs you were mentioning, blueness of the wounds cleanseth away evil. And I can't remember all the stripes in the inward parts of the bellies, all those awful Proverbs injunctions to beat your kids. And it's so to save their soul. Break their body and then you will save their soul.
Exactly. And you will find books, I found two, that were written in the 70s that use that very line you're talking about to justify beating a child until there is a wound. And regardless of how one looks upon corporal punishment, I personally would never use corporal punishment on my child, but even, if you look at what the federal government and states are willing to say in terms of what is abusive corporal punishment, the definition is a physical wound, even if it's just a minor bruise. So essentially, these people are advocating the physical abuse of children based on what the Bible says.
Well, one of those books was probably James Dobson's book, Dare to Discipline. You probably remember that, and how parents need to be strong disciplinarians over their children. Your book identifies certain patterns or certain factors that lead to these worst abuse cases. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I felt it was necessary not just to say, well, there is abuse in faith communities and look how people harm their children, and they also happen to be religious. It really had to go beyond that. I, first of all, wanted to explain how some abuse and some neglect is actually comes about because of the beliefs of the community or of a child's household. Secondly, I wanted to actually differentiate what makes certain kinds of faith harmful to children and what's okay. And so I just, after reading case after case after case and taking a look at all these studies, I determined that there were three perfect storm kind of factors that made certain religious environments unhealthy. And those would be religious authoritarian cultures, as I call them. The three factors would have to be having a strict social hierarchy, having a fear-based culture, and also social separatism. And when you have those three, there's, in my view, it seems borne out in my research that there's a stronger likelihood that there would be religious child maltreatment.
So don't most religions have a very authoritarian base? I mean, an awful lot of them would fulfill number one, but the third one, the separatism, is that sort of where you see the polygamous cult, for example?
Actually, I have found social separatism in many religions and religious communities, even if they're located in urban environments. I'll just throw one example out, which would be Jehovah's Witnesses. You can find Jehovah's Witnesses just about everywhere. You don't have to go out to a compound in West Texas to find people who believe in that faith. But like many faiths, Jehovah's Witnesses do see it necessary to not have members have close relationships with people who are outside the faith. They do want to proselytize and they want to have those bonds. But children are often raised to be wary of anyone who is not a Jehovah's Witness. And you have, in other faiths as well, the perception that anybody who is not part of their religion is part of Satan's world or evil or somehow out to persecute them. So you really can find that social separatism in various degrees just about anywhere.
There's a verse in the Bible that says, be in the world, but not of the world.
Yes. That phrase has been used by these communities. That particular phrase has been used to rationalize why there has to be that isolation.
Well, thank you for writing a very important book, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. We are talking with its author, Janet Heimlich.
Do you have a website?
Yeah, you have a website and blog, right?
I do. Thank you. You can go to breakingtheirwill.com, and that'll present you with all kinds of information about the issue and the book.
Well, thanks again for joining us, and congratulations on your new book, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me.